Um, Good evening, and welcome to the talk, Building and Giving Away Motivations by Greg Newby, who's standing over there. He holds a doctorate in information, something, I forgot, is from Alaska and also has 30 dogs. But he'll be talking about motivation. And if you have any questions or want to share something with us, please stand up, go to the microphone over there, and I'll see you, and I'll look for it that you can ask your questions. And please don't yell into the room because it's not going to be audible on the stream. Thank you, and have fun.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks. It's truly a sensation to be here. I appreciate a good crowd this evening. So what we're going to do is start actually with a job for you, which is giveaways. I have brought plenty, they're right over there, and I've brought a bunch of the Project Gutenberg DVDs, and there are 4 packets, so we'll just start one in each corner of the room, pass them around. I think there's enough. If you want more than one, take more than one, give them to other people. So I wanted to get the giveaway going while this is the beginning of the talk. These are, I'll talk about me in a moment, but I've been involved with Project Gutenberg for a number of years, and these are the DVD we produced last year. This is a dual layer disc, not double-sided, but a dual layer disc, so it's around 8 gigabytes, and as it mentions up here, almost 30,000 books. And what's incredibly cool about this is that in the United States, I don't know about other countries, in the United States, the average public library has around 30,000 books. So in other words, this is a library that's on a disc, and the whole point is to give it away, make it available freely. You can download the ISO if you'd like to, and enjoy. Okay, so that's the giveaway. We'll go ahead and get started with the content of the talk, but I wanted to get that going early so there was time to go around. So this is me. As I mentioned earlier, if people know me a little bit, it's usually because I've been involved with Project Gutenberg now for about 20 years. I'm not the founder of Gutenberg. I have a slide on that later on. That's Michael Hart. But I have been involved for a number of years. There's an organization of which I'm the director and chief executive. I do work on something else during the day, so the Gutenberg role is voluntary, and I'm the director of a supercomputing center in Alaska during the day. I've had a lot of interest in electronic technologies. I've had a lot of interest in information security over the years. And as just mentioned, I have 30 sled dogs. And the site for that is stinkypup.net, stinkypup.net, if you want to look and see what's going on in the dog yard with the sled dogs in Alaska. I should also mention this is my first Chaos Camp, and I'm very happy to be here. I have been involved with the HOPE conferences for about 12 years now, and I've also participated in the Dutch conferences. So I have the abstract in the program. I'd also like to mention that this entire presentation is granted to the public domain, with the exception that I have some images that are not necessarily in the public domain. I got them from the Wikipedia and then some from the Gutenberg site. But my words, gestures, and so forth are to the public domain. Okay, so before we jump into the outline and the substance of the presentation, I will tell you why I made the proposal for this presentation topic. And I am motivated, and it sounds sort of quaint to say, but I really am motivated by a desire to make the world a better place. I have the notion that if I'm successful as a human being, when I'm gone or at the end of my career, at the end of my productive time here, I will have improved things somewhat. And I think that's a common motivation and one that we'll speak of in a few moments. I believe, and I've observed, and there's scientific literature to support, that generally people have this notion. People are altruistic. They have a desire for improvement. And we do it sometimes almost without thinking. We hold the door open for somebody, or if someone drops something, we stand and we help them to pick it up. people are altruistic by design. The social nature of humanity is geared towards community, and community is geared towards helping one another. And we have here in the technological world of open source software and building and giving away devices, doing science, we have situations where people are essentially working for the greater good. And what I wanted to talk about really is, can we make some observations, and I'm not really doing scientific observations, but can we make some observations, maybe look a little bit at the literature and history, and see what works? Can we characterize some winning strategies for the practice of building things and making them freely available, or at least widely available, for the betterment of the community? I have a bunch of images here. I'll mention them in case they're not that clear. Unfortunately, the images and the words overlap sometimes a little bit. That's Creation of Man in the back, the Michelangelo image from the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. We today have many, many people, including, of course, many in this room, many at the camp, who are very engaged in developing technologies and making them available. And yet, many such projects and many of your own ideas, I'm sure, will never get this widespread community adoption. And why is that? Or why is it that some are the winning and some are not the winning projects? Or why is it that sometimes we might have values, for example, we might value freedom and things like this, giving things away, and those values might not win. The winning product might be something that is maybe contrary to those values. And I have a few examples, but you can think of like the Microsoft Windows versus Linux type of mentality. So which one wins in the marketplace? The Windows lives. Which one wins in our minds in terms of our values? Maybe the Linux operating system would win. So the values don't always win, and the good ideas don't always win. So what I'm going to focus on really is the technology-oriented projects, but I'm not going to limit myself, or at least my examples are mostly from software and content, but I'm not going to limit myself to only those types of projects, source code and so forth. I believe that what I'm talking about really does apply to a whole range of human activity, so making and building objects and so forth. But the emphasis really is on technology-oriented communities. And also in the middle there I have a comment that people tend to be separated in time and space. So here, of course, we're together in space, but during the rest of the year you might be contributing to an open source project, you might be working on a hackerspace project, someone else might be doing science and making these contributions, and these communities that we're part of are largely technologically based in terms of their communication. And that's, I think, a really major change. I think that the type of building and giving away that we have today is something which is essentially an internet-enabled phenomenon. Not impossible without the internet, but very much something that can exist more successfully because our communities, for this building and giving away, for this altruism, for these projects, are not co-located. In other words, you might have a physical community, you have a workplace, you have a family and so forth, but maybe those are not the people, or very likely those are not the people with whom you're working on some sort of project. So we need the technology to assist. So I identified 4 major types of motivations, and I believe, I've been thinking about this for a while, I believe that this is a pretty good list. I think that there are further examples and refinements that would make a longer list, but I think these are the main types of motivations. One, as I mentioned earlier, and by the way, most people that are participating actively in any of the types of projects you can think of are are not in this just in one of these categories. You have more details. You have some from each category. But the categories I identified, one is to make the world a better place, this altruism concept. The other is some sort of money, some sort of remuneration, whether or not you're getting paid, or maybe you're getting advancement, maybe you're getting further opportunity, but something related to or similar to money or trade. Another very important one is to be part of a social group, and we see that a lot here, where people come together because they enjoy being with other people of, in some ways, like-minded values. And this is really a very important one when we talk about volunteerism a little bit later on, because when you're trying to get people to participate in your project, well, they better get something out of it personally. Relatively few people are going to be motivated without some sort of community-based feedback, without seeing that they're valued in some way. The last one we'll talk about a little bit later is this itching a scratch phenomenon. You recognize that quote from The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric Raymond. The idea here is to solve some sort of problem, to fix something, to improve something. So you see a system that's broken, you see some software that sucks, you see a product that's too expensive or not widely available or closed or something like this. And how can we make that better? How can we improve? And as I say, people have different motivations. I want to stop just a moment, and because a few people have been coming in. If you have questions, interruptions, just go to the microphone, or in other ways, make that known to me, and I'll repeat it. I don't mind being interrupted as we go. And also, for people that came in, I think there are still some DVDs left on the table here. So, yeah, there's a few here. So if you came in and you didn't get a DVD, try to get one. There's probably about 30 left, I see. These are the dual-layer Project Gutenberg DVD. It has almost 20,000 electronic books. You can also download the ISO from the internet. And, of course, this is a good place to download an ISO. It's around 8 gigabytes, so you just get it on the wired network and you'll be done before you know it. Okay, moving on. So this is a key concept here is altruism. Actually, I think I forgot to mention, I had a picture of meerkats on a previous slide in the background. A meerkat is a creature that has been demonstrated scientifically to have some altruistic behavior. And the primates, the apes and so forth, have been demonstrated to have altruistic behavior. So it's not just human, but of course is a major part of being human. And this is simply the idea of doing something that isn't just for you, something which is for the greater good, whether of humanity or just helping someone else out, helping a family out, and so forth. So this really is my belief, and I believe there's science to support this, is that the desire to help others is a fundamental human trait. So what's nice these days is that we have opportunities, especially as very technologically capable people, of engaging in altruistic behavior with people that are separated from us in time and space. And so we can have some pretty focused, pretty niche communities, a whole bunch of people that maybe are separated, different time zones, different languages and so forth, but are able to work together for some common good. So I'm calling these projects, but as I say, they could be open source, they could be communities, it could be hardware-oriented, science-oriented. Content is actually very important, generating new content, or, of course in Gutenberg we're digitizing electronic books, or digitizing books, making electronic books, but, creating some sort of content. We'll talk about Wikipedia in a few moments. So we have these great virtual communities. Now, even though people are altruistic, that does not mean that everyone has the time to devote. And we can all probably measure for ourselves for projects you're involved with. Maybe you help with a sports team. Maybe you help with a school. Whatever it is you're involved with, you might be able to put some hours in it, but most people don't have the luxury or maybe the motivation or desire or capability or energy or money or anything like this to do it to a large extent. Some do, of course. Okay, I did, this is my elite super PowerPoint skills here. This is about as much as I can do. But the point here is that we have a life, and we hope to be satisfied in life. We're not all satisfied all the time, but we have a goal anyway of being satisfied, of being happy, of being maybe productive, or in other ways feel good about ourselves. And there are many things that make that up. We might have a job, We'll spend some time sleeping. We'll spend some time recreating. We'll spend some time taking care of chores. We have family, we have friends, and somewhere in that mix, we might have time to spend to help make the world a better place, fulfilling our goals, applying our values to something that we care about. And as I mentioned earlier, people do this almost automatically, simply holding the door open for somebody or helping to clean up. If you see a little mess, helping to clean up a little bit. These are examples as well, but really my major concern for today is these projects where the engagement might be ongoing. So, one of my favorite pictures in the background here, from the Tennille illustrations to Alice in Wonderland, with Alice looking up at the Cheshire Cat in the tree. So, I know you'll be able to think of a lot of other examples, but I'll work through a few examples that I think will be pretty well known. And what I want to get towards is some analysis and some shared findings from these examples, but then see if we can generalize a little bit. And I know that people in the audience are going to have additional ideas, and I certainly welcome those. I don't claim to have all the answers. So maybe there are half a dozen or so examples. First one I'll mention is Wikipedia. One thing about Wikipedia is, well, let me give you two things actually. One is that, this is Jimbo Wales, is that there's an individual which is very clearly associated and still exercises some control, but has also given away much of the control over Wikipedia. The other thing about Wikipedia is that they have really a very clear mission. And so you have, and I know there's probably any number of contributors in the world, so you maybe have observed this, they have a lot of contention, they have a lot of disagreement in Wikipedia. And they've actually developed, they've had discussion, community-based discussion, they've developed procedures for dealing with that contention. So you see the locked pages sometimes, and you see the revision wars sometimes, and also you see currently, if you visit Wikipedia, people voting, the ability to vote on accuracy and completeness and so forth. So the cool part is that this is something that really had to be invented by a community in order to fulfill the very clear mission of essentially digitizing content, free online encyclopedia. The other thing I'll mention about this is that Wikipedia actually was derived from an earlier project, somewhat similar, sort of a content-based project that Jimbo and some other people were involved with. But just like almost everything we'll talk about today, was very clearly built upon prior technology. Almost none of these projects came to fruition overnight, and even those that were very original early on, and we'll talk about one next, took literally years to become widely adopted. There's still a number of seats up front if people want to sit. I see people standing in the back. You're welcome to come and sit up front. So that's a little bit about Wikipedia. We have a recognizable individual, although there's diversity afterwards. We have some real innovation in the community, not just developing content, but figuring out how to develop content, how communities can develop content. And we also have, and this is, I think, important, a pretty clear central vision. And what that does is it makes it easier for individuals to get involved with Wikipedia, and it applies to other projects. It makes it easier to get involved, even though all the individuals might share very different values. In other words, you might have very different values. So we have one person that's motivated by religion, and they want to do the religious things. One person that's motivated by science. One person that's involved in a particular thing. They like a particular dog. They like a particular food. They have some expertise, right? These are all very different motivations, and yet the project lets them come together. This, I believe, is important for a successful community of building and giving away. I'll talk about Project Gutenberg. As I mentioned, that's what I've been involved with. I became involved in around 1991, so about 20 years ago. Michael Hart here started this in 1971. So this is really very early days for online electronic community building. And in fact, it did take him until the middle 80s, so over 15 years, before there was really widespread adoption, before there were a number of other people that were working on it. And at that time, those of us that were using computers or on the internet of the day, back in the middle and late 1980s, most people were very critical. You were using the computers of the day, the networks of the day. There were not graphics. This predates Netscape and Mosaic, so no graphical internet. And they really thought this was pretty nuts, many people at the time. So what we have is an individual visionary, but willing to commit very, very large quantities of his energy and really essentially a whole career, a whole lifetime, 40 years now, of effort to pursuing this vision. And this level of effort, this persistence, is something which is, I think, key to many of the most successful projects, many of the biggest ones. The reason is that when you have vision, when you have an idea of how to improve the world, and I know some people in the world have some such ideas, it's not enough just to articulate that or articulate it a few times. You're probably going to have to work pretty hard to implement, to show the pathway from where we are now to where we want to be, to convince others to help, and to state and restate again and reframe and talk about your vision. Because, and we'll talk about this in a moment in more detail, because if you have a vision, by definition, it's something that doesn't yet exist, at least in the way you think of it. And so you have to explain that and be patient about it. And so this is a good example of that. Nowadays, Project Gutenberg has been surpassed. There's just under 40,000 titles in the main collection in the US. There are other collections elsewhere around the world. So 40,000 is not so big compared to Amazon, Kindle ebooks and the content of Google Books and the Internet Archive collection. And yet it still has a lot of participants because people are aware of some differences in the digitization quality and some of the content and so forth. So continues to be successful. And one thing that's nice, we talked about vision a little bit. One thing that's nice is to have sort of in the United States, we would call this a mother and apple pie, which is where you talk about it in terms that everyone can understand and agree is good. And it's pretty easy, in the case of Gutenberg, to say that the main goal is literacy, that we want to foster literacy, foster giving away books in the hopes that people can learn to read, and through reading, be able to educate, and through education, be able to create opportunities for themselves. So that's a pretty nice, clear statement that people can buy into very easily. And of course, Amazon isn't making the same case about Kindle ebooks, right? So this is where we see, and we'll talk about this a little more, we see a similar activity, creation and distribution of electronic books, and yet very dissimilar motivations. And of course, as a project, what we'd like to see, people running any of these projects or starting a new project, usually we'd like to gain people's support and engagement to help out with those projects, and having sort of a vision that you can sign on to is an important part of that. This is just something that Michael mentioned the other day, and again, this is just an example, and I know there are other projects. This is the one, of course, I'm most familiar with, where you have a very clear statement that gives you this lofty ideal. And I think that's not always necessary, but very often in the most successful projects, you see something that's just very clear and lofty, and people can sign up to, people can get excited about. And then, of course, individually, there are many differences. This says one thing about electronic books that most people haven't thought of is that it's the first thing we're able to have as much of as we want, other than air. And you think about that for a moment, and you realize we're doing the right job. So giving away in an unlimited fashion, unlimited distribution, unlimited access, unlimited education. There are some other projects that share this ideal as well, but I just think that's very helpful. He has such a clear statement that people can sign up to. We can talk about Linux for a few moments. Here's Linus in the background here. This was originally, my understanding, sort of an itching a scratch situation. He wanted to introduce a technology to solve some technological problems. And part of, I apologize, the words are sort of fading here, but essentially what it says, the characteristics are similar to what I mentioned earlier. Individual, clearly associated, put in many hours. But one of the key concepts is that I was reading the bio on Wikipedia, and there's a religious agnosticism or atheism, I think is what it says, that is mentioned in the webpage biography. But I think the more important concept is being agnostic about uses. So the Linux kernel and the software ecosystem that surrounds it, it doesn't say no commercial use. It doesn't say you can't profit. It doesn't say that you can't embed this in various ways. The GPL applies, as we know, the license applies on the trademark and so forth. But it's really very open to different types of reuse. And I believe this is important for adoption. And it's certainly important in this particular case for getting community engagement and actually creating the next generation of the product. You know, the actual programmers and all the ecosystem that surrounds Linux, all the distributions and so forth that build up full distributions as opposed to just the operating system. Many of those would not be nearly as motivated if, for example, they were prohibited from reselling. They were prohibited from selling support. They are prohibited from using the word Linux in their marketing materials. And yet you can imagine an alternative founder making different decisions that possibly would squelch or decrease that type of engagement. So I think this is what I mentioned before. People have values, and what you want to do if you want to have one of these big projects anyway, a little project maybe not so important, but if you want to have a big project with widespread community adoption, a multi-year history, then it's important to make it possible for people to contribute because they believe in the project, even though they come from different backgrounds with different values. Let's talk for a few moments about some, I don't know if I would call them counterexamples, but some different examples. The motivations behind the current and somewhat emerging state of these three projects are to a large extent commercial, not 100%. So MySQL, Lustre, and Java are three technologies that were acquired and to some extent developed within Sun Microsystems. In the case of Java, I think that it was a Sun employee, or he was a Sun employee when Java really developed. In the other cases, they were technology acquisitions. Of course, since then, Sun's been acquired by Oracle, and Oracle has a pretty different corporate philosophy, and it's very clear that they are not nearly as altruistic as Sun is. The takeaway here is that the characteristic of having community involvement, visionary, clear vision, clear mission, all these things, this applies, and yet when the money goes away, suddenly the projects are potentially facing trouble. And I think MySQL is pretty solid of all of these, but we saw some real churn with Java. We saw some real angst when Oracle first took over, not too long ago, right, just a little over a year. With whether or not this technology would continue, what would happen to trademarks, what would happen to libraries, all this type of difficulty. So there's a certain risk in the commercialization, but of course there's also a certain benefit. And actually going back, thinking of Linux for a moment, if you look at the committers, I saw a number, I think there are over 1,400 people that have contributed code to Linux over the years. But if you look at the major contributors, my understanding is Red Hat is one of the major contributors, and they're clearly motivated by selling stuff, but they see the ability to contribute not just to the Linux kernel, but of course to many other software projects as a way of building that market. In the case of Sun, I think we had some of the same motivations, maybe not quite as community-oriented, but still a pretty good community participant. In the case of Oracle, looks to me like they're looking at a dollar balance sheet, and they're saying, gee, is Lustre going to make us money? And people might not know what Lustre is. It's a high-performance parallel file system used for supercomputers. And they basically said, no, we're not going to make very much money selling supercomputers. We're not going to make very much money selling Lustre, and so we're going to stop. We're just going to stop. In this case, some other companies stepped in. There were some standards. It's a very interesting story, actually. Just we're still in the midst of it. It's not over yet. But in other cases, I think we see where the commercial support was really a relied upon component, and if it dried up in some way, then problem for the project. Let's mention the wiki reader. Not everyone might be familiar with this. This is an image of it here. I didn't bring mine with me, but it's very cute. It's small. It's a little thicker than a cell phone, but a small screen, about the same size as an Arduino screen. And this is simply a device that runs on a couple of AA batteries, which is intended to be deployed to places where maybe they don't have electricity, regularly reliable electricity, maybe they don't have much of an education system, maybe computers and internet are difficult to obtain, and yet it has the full content, the text only, of Wikipedia, and they update this a few times a year. They have another, you can download the Gutenberg content as well and a few other collections, but the main selling point is the copy of Wikipedia. So this is great, right? I just gave you a DVD and you can walk around with a library in your pocket or copy it to a thumb drive or put it on a little corner of your hard drive or your cell phone. This is a concept here where you can have this entire free open encyclopedia that you can take with you. One thing that's interesting about this, we talked a few moments ago in projects about commercial influence and about having an openness to values. And in the case of WikiReader, they had to actually make some value judgments. They decided to include some parental controls. They decided to exclude some content. They had to give thought to the frequency of updates. And also, this is about $100 for this unit. And they had to say, okay, we have all these other great ideas for features, but if we want to keep it at maybe $100, we can't add every single feature, right? So we can't add a backlit screen and a touch screen and wireless and on and on and on with these types of features, because then the price will go up. And that's the same type of difficulty that happened with the one laptop per child project that some people maybe are familiar with as well. So they're constantly making these trade-offs, and that I think is a very common topic for these different projects. So since we're talking about hardware, let's talk for a minute about openness. There's another talk that's going to be talking about making an open source, a hardware open source cell phone. And you can Google and you'll find some examples of free MP3 players and things like that. It's tough to know whether these will succeed or not because there are a lot of challenges. I think I have another slide that'll talk about those for a moment. But the example here is start with the IBM PC versus the Apple, and then think in terms of the Android versus the Apple device, the iPhone, iPad, iPod type device. These are very important different distinctions from the point of view of people that are pretty up to speed and educated about it, like in this room. They're maybe not so important to the general public consumer. But the background on this that probably people are familiar with to some extent, but probably some people aren't so familiar, is that when the IBM PC was first developed, this was the first commercially successful, not the first portable computer, personal computer, but the first commercially successful one. Part of why that was immediately successful was that IBM opened the technical specifications. So within literally less than a year, there were clones. There were IBM PC clones made by other companies. And these days, of course, the standard remains essentially an open standard. This is pretty different than the Apple approach. And there have been any number of other companies over the years, but IBM and Apple are still with us. Any number of other companies were developing, sort of competing products. But in the case of IBM versus Apple, it's an open approach versus a lock-in approach. Same thing, Android versus iPhone, right? You get your Android, you go to the Android phone, you can download the SDK, you can buy literally dozens of different devices with different versions of Android, different spins on the software, because people do variations, and they're able to do that. You get the iPhone, you get the iPad, you get the iPhone. You're pretty well locked in, not only as a developer, where you're pretty restricted, and I know some people are very familiar with this. You're pretty restricted in terms of what you're allowed to do with the software and how you're allowed to market it. And you have to put it in the Apple Store if you want to get it on people's devices and so forth. But as an end user, you're very restricted. So you can plug your iPhone into your computer, but you're not going to be able to get content on or off it or manage it without using iTunes. And iTunes is going to restrict what you're allowed to do, right? One of my common things, I look at a lot of these readers for Project Gutenberg. I've looked at almost all of them at this point. And so one of the things I do is I say, can I get a Project Gutenberg on the book on this device? So I've done this with, there's a page on Gutenberg.org that describes this. I've done this with the Kindle, I've done this with the Nook, I've done it with the Kobo, I've done it with the iPhone, iPad, and a few other devices. And the characteristic is, yeah, you can get a book on it. You can get a free book from Gutenberg.org, download it, and through some mechanism, in the case of the iPhone, you have to use iTunes, but through some mechanism, get it on your device. But in the case of iTunes, once it's on there, it's like you don't own it anymore. You have very limited abilities to get it off or to share it with other people. So it's actually a sort of a freedom-reducing pathway. So anyway, that's sort of a digression that I know people are somewhat aware of, but there's these values that are associated with the, essentially with the device. And what I think the sort of takeaway point from here is that for better or for worse, that characteristic is something that a technological-oriented audience understands. We understand sort of freedom and digital rights management and open source and, you know, these types of things. General consumers, not so much, right? So they're still selling a whole lot of these devices that lock you in. So this is an open question, I think, still, but I wanted to draw attention to it. Part of why it's so important, and I know, as I say, there's a talk that's focusing on just on mobile devices. Current statistics, around 4.5 billion mobile devices, currently registered mobile devices. In other words, people with cell phone numbers. Active people with cell phone numbers, not just like old devices that are in, because I have, 10 or 20 over the years, right? But not just devices that are in landfills or not in use, but 4.5 billion active devices versus maybe 1 billion or so computers. These are really important. If you're thinking of a project, if you're thinking of how you can get adoption, think in terms of what are people carrying around with them? How are people experiencing the internet? What is the role of a device in someone's personal lives? And the mobile devices are just really, really important these days. Okay, so let's continue on. I gave sort of a couple of very good examples, the Wikipedia and the Gutenberg and the Wiki Reader. So these are essentially positive exemplars. Talked about some of the risks that occur in the case of the Sun projects. Let's talk about where, I'm sorry, I talked about the challenge of sort of the lock-in approach, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not successful. iPhones and whatnot, very successful despite the lock-in. Kindles, all these things. They lock you in, they restrict you, and yet they're very successful. Let's talk about something that's, I think, not so successful, the General Purpose Graphics Processing Unit, GPU programming. This, I think, will be successful. I think it's just been slowed greatly. Adoption has slowed greatly, or I shouldn't say adoption, innovation has slowed greatly because of churn, uncertainty, and the very strong role of commerce in creating these devices. So the idea here, some people might not be as familiar as others, the idea here is using a GPU, a graphics card, for offloading computational activities that your CPU would otherwise be doing. And because the GPUs have hundreds of separate computational cores, even though they're less capable than a CPU core, a multi-core processor, but a GPU will have hundreds as opposed to a CPU that has 2 or 4, maybe 8 or 16, something like this. So you can scale out quite a bit. You can have many more threads in flight. So that's the idea, and it's a very powerful idea, but it takes a lot of work to adopt your algorithms and adopt your software to make use of these GPU devices. And the takeaway point here is that I think this would have happened already if the developers weren't chasing after NVIDIA versus AMD, and Intel's doing a few things, and there are 1 or 2 other companies in there. and simultaneously trying to juggle the different languages, the different SDKs, the fact that the drivers for these graphics cards are necessary but usually are not open source. So these are all just barriers to adoption. Plus it's hard work. You have to redo your algorithms. So this is demotivating. And yeah, there are many people developing software, but not nearly as many, and not as many successes as we I think would otherwise have. So let's we'll take a step back and come up with some generalities from what we've been talking about here. And I should mention that not every project, or not everyone that starts some sort of project, say a software project or a hardware project or a science project or a content project, not everyone is trying to be the next great thing. But I think a lot of us dream of it. You know, we dream that we're going to come up with the next, you know, name it, whatever it is, get widespread adoption, get many people to subscribe to our vision, to get engaged. And the example here, just briefly, is SourceForge has about 1/3 active software projects right now. And that's a whole lot. But many of those have just one developer, the person that thought of it. And many of those are no longer active. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think you can still have plenty of good from that. But creating the next big thing, the next big project, I think needs some of what I've been talking about here today, the clarity of vision and so forth. Let's spend the next 2 slides and we'll talk about the individuals involved, because as I've characterized so far, and I think there are counterexamples, but usually it's individuals that have the vision, individuals that push the ideas, that articulate them, and put some effort in. But the problem is, if you push too hard or if you're too far ahead of the game, you might have difficulty with that. So we have this idea where there's, and I know people are familiar with this, you know, we use the word hacker, and hacker is simultaneously negative, problem, criminal, so forth, bad side, intruder, fraudster. And yet hacker is also something we admire. So the story of Woz and Jobs being the hardware, or Woz at least being the hardware hacker behind innovations for the Macintosh computer, right? We have a lot of great mythology that surrounds hackers. And in fact, depending on whose opinion you share, people will trace back and talk about Galileo. And here we have Socrates. So it's not too visible. It's a bust of Socrates, who was maybe an early example of a culture hacker. Well, Socrates was tried for heresy and forced to commit suicide by drinking hemlock for poisoning the minds of children. Speaking of poisoning the minds of children, if people are extremely energetic, if they just can't sit still because they have so many ideas and they have so many things they want to do, in the United States, don't know if it's the same in the rest of the world, they find themselves on Ritalin, which is a drug that calms them down, or they find themselves going into counseling, or they find themselves in a special school. And this actually is, you've heard of different epidemics in the United States. There's an epidemic of the disorder where people just can't sit still. They have too much energy. And so this is perceived as a problem. So if you have great ideas, then you have to present that in a way that becomes actionable. And I think this is important because, as I said, I know there's people in the room that have vision and want to enlist others in your vision. And it's critical to be persistent and be willing to put in the work, but it's also critical that you are not, you don't ostracize yourself as you're communicating that vision. Here's a great quote that brings that home from George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw has some amazing quotes. You can look some of these up. Amazing quotes. This one says, "Reasonable people adapt themselves to the world. Unreasonable people attempt to adapt the world to themselves. All progress, therefore, depends on unreasonable people." This, I think, is really important. If you're motivated to pursue your vision, to change the world, to make the world a better place, of course you can do that incrementally. And I think most people in the world probably are, probably in numerous ways, contributing to various projects, communities, job, family, all that is great. If you want to really shake things up, if you want to invent electronic books or invent the graphical web or invent a new standard, create a new community, figure out how to make money by giving away software, just some of these big things that you can think of, you're going to be unreasonable. You're going to be out there somewhere where most people cannot see, most people cannot understand this new vision that you have. But that's how progress occurs. So all the people that are spoken of, the big projects. And by the way, I should mention, I have a few slides to talk about companies and the role of money. This tends not to come from companies or other sort of organizations. Most of them are not so good at innovation. And even when they are, and there are many examples of this, maybe I'll give one of the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, that invented, or people there invented personal computers, graphical computing, the mouse as a gesture-oriented input device in the late 1960s. Very early days. So, excuse me, so even those organizations that do have this ability to foster innovation maybe aren't so good at turning it into something that can really change the world. So the innovation doesn't come off the shelves. So it's the individuals that have to be unreasonable to make the innovation. Here's an example of conflicting values. WikiLeaks. We had an open leaks presentation, I think, already today, and there's some other talk in the air about this. And I just had the opportunity to watch I'm sure some people have seen it. There's a PBS, the Public Broadcasting System in the U.S., did a documentary on WikiLeaks, and it was criticized for a variety of things. And yes, of course, they got a whole bunch of things wrong. But what they did was they went and talked to most, not all, of the major players. They talked to Julian Assange, and they got a lot of. They didn't talk to Bradley Manning, but they got a lot of the backstory from Bradley Manning. They got some other people from WikiLeaks organization. They talked to defense people, in the United States military and intelligence communities, and so forth. Here's the point. Oh, they talked to Adrian Lamo as well. Here's the point. Everyone thought they were doing the right thing. Everyone had a view on what was the best thing, the ideal thing, the thing to do that was right. But they disagreed. There's a social context to technology. There's a value to the activity. And in the different projects that we can think of, and I just gave a few examples here, there are values associated with it. And I think one of the things that's key, and I gave the example of Linux for one, is people can have very different motivations for engaging in that project and yet still have progress towards the good. This is an example, I think, the WikiLeaks, where we have what I just mentioned, this unreasonable thing to do. Unreasonable to take classified information and make it available, maybe put people at risk, maybe, embarrass governments, all these types of things. Sounds unreasonable, right? Or at least many people would say it is. We don't have necessarily the social context to say whether that's necessarily a good approach or a bad approach. And over time, of course, I think that will get worked out. I gave a thought experiment, or had a thought experiment myself on WikiLeaks, is one of the stories is the cables. They did a whole bunch of these diplomatic cables. These are governments, they're about governments, they're government business. How would this be different if you were instead doing it on a local basis? If you had the city council, the town council, if you had your workplace, your soccer club, things like this, doing leaks. I think that the values would mature more quickly there because they would be something that we individually could understand a little bit better. So in other words, if maybe a memo that you wrote was leaked in the workplace or among some community that you're part of. Anyway, it's just a thought experiment. The point here is that actions, technologies themselves not so much good, not so much bad. There's a social context which makes that, that occur. All right, a couple slides on money, and I think I'll just go through these quickly. But the idea here is that money can help, but that also, and I gave the example with the Sun technologies, Java, MySQL, and Lustre, sometimes money can be a problem. It can be a limiting factor. And yet it is a major motivator, and in fact, many of the innovators that I've spoken about so far have actually made a career out of doing their project. But the ones I've spoken about were at least originally motivated not by money. The most successful projects that I can think of were not originally motivated by money. They were originally motivated by something else, itching a scratch, making the world a better place. But money can help. It can also tie you in a little bit. And the examples that I could think of where companies are doing greater good stuff, usually it's not so much they're giving away their business. I'm sorry, I'm not saying this well. Larger businesses, to the extent that they're engaged in philanthropy and altruism, usually that's a spin-off. Or it's just a few things that they're hoping to make a dollar off of eventually. So Red Hat contributes to all these open source projects, but this is in their own self-interest to do so, because then they turn around and they sell support for those software products. All right. Bottom line there is money is essentially a benefit and a risk. Smaller businesses tend to do a lot better than larger businesses, and in fact, many businesses have come out of different sort of software projects. And I think a lot of people dream that, and then some succeed, that they might take their idea and someday turn it into something that can employ themselves, keep their family fed, and so forth. And in many cases, we have entire ecosystems. I mentioned Drupal, PHP, and WordPress sort of overlapping with PHP. But these are examples where there's a whole bunch of small businesses that are doing great innovations, selling their services, and simultaneously contributing to the greater good. Okay, enough on money. Let me talk about boundaries for a moment. This is sort of a little bit of both. Make Magazine. I'm not sure how widely known it is actually in Europe, but it's on the bookstore shelves in the United States. It's only been out a few years now. But this is essentially a maker in terms of like hardware hacker type magazine. And they have a television show, they have blogs, all this other type of stuff. Very similar in a lot of ways to the hackerspace concept, you know, of hardware hacking type of activity. Here's the point. The point is that Make, for all its wonder, and I like it a lot, I subscribe, you know, think it's a wonderful thing. For all of this, I think there are some real boundaries that we're not going to see them cross, and yet are never very well defined. So we can think of things where the powers that be at Make Magazine will not be publishing. What will they not be publishing? Well, think of a few things that we're doing here, and that's probably a pretty good listing, right? Hacking your mobile phone, making your own mobile phone network, you know, launching your own alternate internet, firearms, explosives. We're probably not going to see a whole lot of that. Space exploration. Maybe there's a little bit of space, but yeah, exactly. So there's some. It's interesting because you're not going to find this written on their magazine website, but I think there are some boundaries that we're not going to cross. They have some great stuff though. Okay, I think I already talked about that. I'm getting out of time, so I want to make sure I finish, and people might have questions or comments. So how does this work? I think we're all sold. We're here in this room. You've been with me for 50 minutes, 53 minutes now. I don't think I need to convince you of the value of building things, of giving them away, of working towards a social good. But I think most people don't really think that deeply about the relationship to projects to our values. And yet, if you want people to contribute hundreds or thousands of hours, which you're likely to need in one of these big projects, then you better have some pretty clear articulation of what it is you're trying to do, and your core of volunteers needs to be ready to enlist, even though they come from very different cultures, different backgrounds, and so forth. Actually, I'll skip this one. This is just a few steps where you develop an idea, you develop a solution, you enlist the help of others, and you sort of iterate over this and evolve over time. Let's focus on some of the commonalities. One is that individual vision. I think I've talked about this enough already, actually. There's someone with a vision, someone that's willing to put a lot of work into it. And usually there's a role, and people are different, of course, but there's a role of being a dictator or of being a monarch or of being some other form of authoritarian figure. Why? Because without that, it's tough to get done. Committees aren't that good, you know, at vision, at detailed planning. They're good at implementation. So we have this big man mentality, and I mentioned some of the individuals in these other projects. And I think what's key for my message here is, as I said, you might have a vision, or you might want to find someone with a vision or work towards a vision, and you really have to be prepared to put yourself out there, or find someone, you know, that can be out there. WikiLeaks, you have Julian, obviously. Linux, you have Linus, obviously. So people are out there devoting a whole lot of time. They're articulate, they're you know, able to communicate their vision, and they're also, at least to some extent, some better than others, tolerant of different values coming towards their projects. So I think this is important. I also should mention difficulty in dealing with problem people with different visions, people with maybe a better ability to tear down and break than to build and give away. Successful communities attract these. And it's just part of what happens on the internet these days. And yet, the criticism isn't necessarily bad. Having people with strong opinions that conflict with other people's opinions, even with the leader's opinions, is not necessarily bad. What you need, among other things, is the strength of vision, leadership, and policy, and of course also technical controls, like the Wikipedia locked pages, that type of thing, to let you make progress anyway. But I wanted to highlight that as essentially like money. It's something that you can benefit from, but something that can be challenging as well. This, I think, is really neat. Probably not that many people have been through a project where you've seen this, but I've observed it several times now. And if you haven't observed it yourself, you can look and see that this has happened. Is when you have successful projects. So let's take Linux. Suddenly you have people that believe so strongly that they'll be correcting the leader, the visionary, and saying, no, you misunderstood that. This is our belief. So clarity of vision is good, but if you're really successful, then you get true believers. You get people that are enlisted to help. And this is, I think, a sign of success. I'm just in my last couple minutes here, so I'm gonna go very quickly through these last ones. Summary of the things that work. I've talked about putting effort in. I've talked about the risk of money, the risk of lucre, and I've talked about the engagement of communities, even though people come with so many different values. So if we go around the room, pick a community, you know, whatever it is, say you're hardware hacking, people have all kinds of different values in terms of, I don't know, religion and education and culture and politics and on and on. And yet you come together for this common project. That is necessary, I think, to be one of these successful large projects. Smaller projects, maybe you just need a couple people. Sometimes we get distracted by technologies. We spend time developing technologies, getting into problems that are maybe tangential to our activity. Focus is important. Last two slides here. One is volunteers are important. We have this meritocracy framework. We're very open to engagement by people with different abilities. We try to lower barriers. And yet many projects, Linux is a good example, are actually somewhat elitist. You have to pass some level of barrier to get the ability to commit code and so forth. Different projects have different characteristics. The barrier to entry, the level of training, the openness to new volunteers is going to be a little different for different ones. But you have to sustain through volunteerism. Essentially, it's really important. Okay, so timing matters. You're building on prior work and all of these innovations, and vision is important. Articulating vision rather, being able to work on it and so forth, very important. But also there's a social context and a temporal context that will determine whether or not you're able to do what it is you want to do. So the last couple points here, as a contributor, and I know there are many contributors, you vote with your energy. You find something that adheres to your values, at least to some extent, and contribute to it. Maybe over time you become a leader. You go through this meritocracy, or maybe you are even starting a new project. And this is where you have to be patient, persistent, be willing to put in the work, not get distressed because people don't understand what seems so clear to you as a visionary. And as a human, remember that you bring your values with you, and that this energy that we are all, to one extent or another, devoting to making the world a better place, be selective and thoughtful about where you direct that energy, and think at least somewhat broadly for what you're doing today, what you're thinking of doing tomorrow, about how that might contribute to the overall good of humanity. So I think those are my concluding thoughts. I appreciate you bearing with me. I didn't get any interruptions, but we might have a couple of minutes for questions. And please make sure, are there any DVDs left? Yeah, there are a few DVDs left up in the AV table. If you didn't get one, just stop up at the end of the talk to grab one. Questions, I think, need to go to the microphone, which our herald will bring around, if you have one. No? Okay. Thanks for bearing with me. Have a good dinner tonight. Enjoy the blinking lights and the light show. And please do remember to give away books. That you can't go wrong.
One more thing, the next talk is going to be about those blinky fancy name badges we are all carrying around with us. It's going to be in roughly 30 minutes.